In Hollywood, a dead man isn't who he appears to be, and someone just walked away with $1 million insurance benefit. Now, forensics must prove that murder was part of the package. A police officer kills his wife in a freak car accident, but investigators believe he may have been driven to homicide. A simple farmer stands accused of murdering his brother, and a town rallies to his defense. So does forensic science. They look death in the face every day of their lives. From fragments of bone, drops of blood, and slivers of tissue, they can piece together the shattered circumstances that bring the deceased to their labs. Every body has a story to tell, and each is a page in the coroner's casebook. When someone dies, their work begins. Coroners, medical examiners, and criminalists know that every kind of death leaves its subtle mark. And they know murder when they see it. Early in the morning of April 16, 1988, the Glendale, California 911 dispatcher received a call about a man in cardiac arrest. The call was placed by Dr. Richard Boggs, a respected neurologist. When paramedics arrived at his office, he explained that the man was one of his patients named Gene Hansen, who had a history of heart trouble. The victim had credit cards in Hansen's name. Before he called 911, Dr. Boggs said he'd done all he could to revive his patient, but nothing worked. Gene Hansen was declared dead at the scene. At the LA County Coroner's Office, the body was given a routine autopsy. The office sees 200 bodies each day, and this one was just another face in the crowd. Seeing no immediate cause of death except for a few marks on the heart, the coroner deferred to the diagnosis of the victim's personal physician, Dr. Boggs. Hansen's cause of death was listed as heart failure due to a dangerous heart condition. The body was released to the hands of John Hawkins, Hansen's companion and his partner in their successful sportswear business. He flew to California from Ohio to claim the remains. He had them cremated in respect for Hansen's last request. Hawkins, as his partner's sole beneficiary, then received the first million of Hansen's $1.5 million life insurance policy. Usually, that would be the end of the story. But this story was just getting started. 5 months after the death, an insurance agent was closing Hansen's file when she noticed something strange. The face on Hansen's autopsy photo didn't resemble the photo supplied by the Department of Motor Vehicles. To double check, she requested that the thumbprint on file at the DMV be compared with the one from the autopsy. No doubt about it. These were two different men. And that raised two vital questions. Where was the real Hansen, and who was the dead man? The agent had uncovered something a lot more serious than insurance fraud. Though they're situated next to each other, the difference between Glendale, California and North Hollywood is like night and day. But this is where Glendale police went to solve the mystery of the dead man who wasn't Gene Hansen. Police determined from fingerprints and missing persons reports that the man was really a bookkeeper named Ellis Green. He was last seen leaving a bar in North Hollywood on April 15th. The next day, he was declared dead under an assumed name in Dr. Boggs's office. Sergeant John Perkins of the Glendale Police tried to sort out what happened.
A photograph of Ellis Green's body that was depicted in the doctor's office was taken to his elderly aunt, and that photo was shown to her. She identified that as being Ellis Green, her nephew. Now we knew we had the real body, the real name, but we still didn't have an exact or approximate cause of death.
Demonstrating how Green died was only half the task before him. Investigators also had to prove that the real Gene Hansen was still alive. By now, months had passed. If Hansen were alive, he had an enormous head start to find a hiding place. John Hawkins, his partner in this elaborate insurance scam, had also vanished, along with $1 million of insurance money.
Michael Bodden, John Perkins.
Police concentrated on the last person to see the victim alive, Dr. Boggs.
Hello, officers from Dr. Boggs. What can I do for you?
Police paid a visit to him to find out about the man who died in his office. Boggs told them that he'd been a patient for years. Boggs knew him only as Melvin Eugene Hansen, or Gene. He had no reason to suspect it was an assumed name. Faced with a search warrant, he handed over his patient's files. Sergeant Perkins examined them. It was possible that Dr. Boggs was telling the truth. Gene Hansen's records showed that he'd been repeatedly warned about his condition, but refused to follow doctor's orders. But it was also possible that Dr. Boggs was in on this elaborate insurance scam, and the records themselves were doctored. Perkins pulled 3 EKG strips, dated several months apart. He wondered if they truly demonstrated the life-threatening heart condition that supposedly killed Green. He asked a cardiologist to analyze the EKGs. The heart specialist told him that they indicated a mild, common condition that wasn't fatal. Perkins was more suspicious than ever that Dr. Boggs had intentionally faked the records. But he couldn't prove it. Then he found the answer was right on the EKG strips. Simple enough for even a layman to understand.
Late one night, I was sitting at my desk and I'm looking at these EKG strips and I'm going through them and I'm looking at them and suddenly it became very obvious. One was completely clean. One had a red dye halfway down the length of the EKG strip, and the other one had a complete dye from the entire length of the EKG strip. And you suddenly think, wait a minute, these are all connected. So I put them up on the desk and put them end to end, and sure enough, the fractures matched perfectly.
The red markings, signaling the end of the roll, formed one continuous darkening line across 2 of the 3 strips, allowing Perkins to put them into sequential order. But when he did so, the dates that Boggs wrote on the back of the strips were out of order and months apart.
These were fabricated EKG strips.
While Perkins was making his discovery, the case was progressing on a different front.
You want to check this area in here, and I'll go in the kitchen and check. Okay.
Police were following the trail of Ellis Green's credit card purchases. The dead man's cards were still active and still in use. Investigators weren't sure who was using them, but they hoped it was the real Gene Hansen. They tracked the card to a bungalow on Key West, Florida. The rental agent confirmed that the tenant was a man named Ellis Green. He had moved out weeks earlier, and the apartment hadn't been rented since. Detectives looked for any clues that could reveal the identity of the former occupant. On a glass in a cabinet, they found one, a fingerprint. It matched Gene Hansen's. Now they had proof that he was alive.
Sir, could you have a seat there?
Then, in January 1989, 9 months after his reported death, Gene Hansen, traveling under another assumed name, was stopped at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport returning from Mexico. He'd been acting eccentrically enough for customs agents to pull him over and inspect his suitcases. They found $14,000 in cash that he failed to declare, thereby breaking the law. They also found the IDs for 13 people. Among them was Ellis Green's, the dead man in Dr. Boggs's office. Here was proof that he'd switched identities with the victim and pocketed some of his own death benefits. He was arrested. With Gene Hansen captured and the incriminating EKG strips, police had enough to arrest Boggs as well. They knew they had him for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. In fact, they uncovered evidence that he and Hansen had pulled off some fraudulent claims in the past. The two of them, along with John Hawkins, staged car accidents for the insurance money. Dr. Boggs was the physician who signed off on their medical claims. But was there enough evidence to prove that Boggs actually murdered Ellis Green as part of the conspiracy? Without a body, they didn't seem to have much of a case. Boggs claimed that they originally hoped to steal a body from the morgue, but that proved impossible. Then, by gruesome coincidence, the conspirators said they happened upon Ellis Green's body shortly after he died. Despite how unlikely the story sounded, Boggs challenged the prosecution to prove he was lying. Glendale Police Sergeant John Perkins had to somehow turn an elaborate insurance scam into a case of homicide. Gene Hansen, the man who faked his own death, and Richard Boggs, the accommodating physician, were already in custody. Perkins was eager to put all the pieces together and wrap it up, but there was still no sign of John Hawkins, the beneficiary who fled with the $1 million insurance payout. And still, investigators were short on evidence to prove what they strongly suspected, that Dr. Boggs murdered Ellis Green to pass him off as Gene Hansen.
We really needed somebody who could look at the entire pieces of evidence that we had, that being the autopsy report, some of the tissues. There was a stomach content that was collected at the time of autopsy, and examine those from an independent view, to look at the crime scene photos, to give us some indication as to this person did not die of natural causes. And that's when we brought in Dr. Michael Baden.
Michael Baden is the executive director of the New York State Police Forensic Science Unit. He's also an expert on the nuances that death leaves on the body. He has worked on the congressional committees that investigated the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. In the case of Ellis Green, Baden had slides of his heart, lung, and liver tissue, as well as photographs of the victim that were taken shortly after death. From this evidence, Baden could determine two facts with confidence. One, Green did not have a fatal heart condition, and two, his skin, which showed no other marks, was blue at the time of death, suggesting lack of oxygen. From these two facts, Baden reached a single conclusion: Green was suffocated. Except for the telltale blue color, In the absence of a struggle, suffocation leaves no marks. Its diagnosis comes from eliminating all other possible causes of death. It's a diagnosis of exclusion.
A bullet wound, we don't need a diagnosis of exclusion because we find a hole in the body. A stab wound or a blow from a baseball bat all leave marks on the body that we can see at autopsy. But if something is put over the nose and mouth, causing a person to die because he or she can't breathe, and then that object is removed, a hand or a pillow, at the autopsy there's no specific finding that's going to say that he was suffocated.
The evidence was enough to convince a jury that the three men had planned the crime together, and that Dr. Boggs, the healer, was Dr. Boggs, a killer.
These three individuals were not strangers to crime. They had hooked up probably 4 years before this particular murder, and they had worked out different ways of committing insurance fraud. And the plan that they evolved was somebody had to die. That person, they agreed, was to be Gene Hansen. And the only way that they could pull this thing off was with a doctor, and that doctor was Dr. Boggs.
Police believe that Boggs picked Ellis Green up at a bar, the last place he had been seen. He bought him some drinks to make him more compliant. The victim's blood alcohol content was well above the legal limit. Then, Boggs lured him to his office. Just in case the victim was still sober enough to fight back, Boggs may have incapacitated him with a stun gun. Then the victim was smothered without putting up a fight. Perkins believes that the forensic pathologist's determination of murder made this case winnable.
Dr. Bodden's testimony in this particular case, I feel, was that last inning, you're down by 2 and bases are loaded, and Dr. Bodden came in and basically hit a home run for us.
In 1990, Richard Boggs was found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. It took 3 years and a worldwide manhunt before police caught up with John Hawkins on the island of Sardinia. In 1995, both he and Melvin Eugene Hansen were convicted of fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hansen was given life without parole. Hawkins received 25 years to life. The work of the medical examiner undermined the murderous conspiracy of Gene Hansen and his cohorts. But whether a crime is ingenious or devilishly simple, the forensics required to solve it is equally complex. On the rainy night of November 27, 1992, just after 9:30 p.m., a passing motorist reported what looked like an accident on Hawaii's Volcano Highway. Police arrived to find a van facing the wrong way, apparently after spinning. The responding officer recognized the owner of the van to be Ken Matheson, a sergeant on the police force. Ken was badly shaken up. His wife, Yvonne, fared much worse. Ken had tended to her in the back of the van until help arrived. She had lost a lot of blood. By strange coincidence, Yvonne Matheson was a nurse who helped deliver the responding officer's first child weeks before. Paramedics moved her into the ambulance to rush her to the hospital at Hilo. The hospital where she worked became the place where she died. When Ken Matheson's fellow officers heard about the incident on the police radio, they went to see him at the hospital. Matheson told one of his colleagues that his wife's death was a terrible accident. She was driving the van when they started to fight. Things escalated. Enraged beyond reason, Ivan jumped out of the open window of the moving van. Ken said he slid over to steer the vehicle, then backed up to look for his wife. That's when he ran over her. Ivan and Ken Matheson had once been divorced, but then decided to give their marriage a second chance. It seemed to be working this time, give or take the usual rough spots. Then this tragedy destroyed it all. According to Hilo police, any accident that results in death is considered negligent homicide. For this misdemeanor, Matheson could expect a maximum fine of $1,000 and a year in jail. At the least, he'd be fined $100 or be sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
Don't worry.
In any case, he'd be able to keep his badge. He didn't protest the charges. As in any sudden death, a complete investigation would have to be conducted. It was a formality. The death of Ivan Matheson was unfortunate and tragic, but police had no reason to doubt Ken's story. While the investigation was underway, Matheson stayed on active duty with the police force. But after inspecting the scene of the accident, Hawaii County Police noticed some minor inconsistencies between the roadside evidence and Matheson's story. At first, they seemed hardly worth mentioning. Each year, tourists flock to Hawaii to escape the cares of their daily lives. The sun, the surf, and the primal fiery beauty of the volcanoes exert their cleansing influence. For Hawaii's inhabitants, life in paradise goes on just like anywhere else. Crimes are committed, accidents happen, and investigators are charged with determining which is which. In Hilo, traffic investigators inspected the area where the wife of Sergeant Ken Matheson lost her life. They found relatively little blood on the highway compared to what was found in the van. Though it was a little peculiar, they wrote it off to the rain and the fact that Ken Matheson had rushed his dying wife into the van after he struck her. At the police impoundment lot, the van had its own story to tell. It was routine procedure for a vehicle involved in a fatal accident to undergo a mechanical inspection. It negates any future defense claims of faulty equipment. Police also had to be sure the van was safe to drive before they could release it to Matheson. Because of the nature of this accident, the undercarriage was thoroughly inspected. Hawaii County Police traffic investigator Martin Elazar was surprised by the relative lack of damage he found there. However, when he was done inspecting the outside, the interior of the van caught his interest.
I peered inside from the outside and I could see blood stains. Blood stains on the driver's side window, blood stains on the plastic cover to the panel area fronting the steering wheel. Blood stains up above there. There's a heavy concentration of blood and hair on that bolt.
There was no reason for blood to be in the driver's portion of the vehicle. Elazar needed a closer look. But to search inside the van required a warrant. he asked Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn to request one. The warrant came through in the nick of time. 3 months had passed since the incident. According to Spohn, their main piece of evidence almost slipped through their fingers.
You do a mechanical inspection, and once all the mechanical inspections and the search warrants are finished, you return the van to the owner. And in this case, the van was authorized to be returned to the owner.
Fortunately, Matheson hadn't picked it up yet. The van was secure. The release authorization was canceled. A search warrant for the van's interior was issued. Now, Spohn had to face the dismal possibility that Sergeant Matheson's story might be a lie. And though they still had the van, another piece of vital evidence was lost forever.
We decided that this case was possibly more than a negligent homicide, and because of that, we decided we should probably have a forensic pathologist do an autopsy in this case. However, at that time, we found out that the body had been cremated.
Yvonne Matheson's body had been autopsied 3 days after her death. On the island of Hawaii, the coroner is also the chief of police. A pathologist from a nearby hospital is retained as a consultant. The pathologist was told that the death was accidental. But a pathologist specializes in natural causes of death, such as disease. Even so, he could tell that the victim's injuries didn't jibe with Ken Matheson's account. The pathologist noted injuries to the victim's head, arms, and hands that weren't consistent with being run over or tumbling out of the vehicle. But the interpretation of these injuries lay outside the scope of the consulting pathologist's training. It was really a job for a forensic pathologist who specializes in death by unnatural causes. Still, puzzled by his findings, the pathologist was sure to photograph every aspect of the victim and to take tissue samples. Now that the victim had been cremated, they were all that was left. A tragic accident case was now turning ugly. Spohn knew there was enough cause to open a homicide investigation, but without a body, there might not be enough evidence to resolve it. The original pathologist's photos and the evidence from the van would have to be enough. He braced himself for the inevitable public outcry.
In some ways, it's kind of a no-win situation. If you investigate and find out that the police officer is innocent and you announce that, everybody says, well, it's swept under the rug because this is a police officer. And if you investigate the case and you find out that the officer is guilty and you charge him, everybody says you're only charging him because you're buckling under to public pressure and he's actually innocent.
Sure enough, 6 months into the investigation, widespread criticism forced Sergeant Ken Matheson's superiors to put him on desk duty while he remained a suspect. The press coverage brought to light an intriguing incident. A witness who read about the case in the papers told investigators that on the night of the accident, he stopped to help shortly after 9 p.m. As he pulled over, a man, possibly Ken Matheson, stepped from the back of the van and shined a flashlight in his eyes. He told the Samaritan that no one was injured and that the police had already been called. Then he sent him away. Investigators now suspected that perhaps the passerby interrupted the crime in progress. They just had to prove it.
One of the interesting things about
In Hawaii, Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn faced the unhappy task of investigating Sergeant Ken Matheson for murder. To find out more about the blood spatter in the driver's area of Matheson's van, he asked a colleague to locate the best blood spatter expert in the country.
Approximately a 28-mile drive. A couple of days later, he told me that it was someone by the name of Dr. Henry Lee, who was the head of the Connecticut State Forensics Laboratory.
Henry Lee, who is now commissioner of the state's Department of Public Safety, uses the laws of physics to uphold the laws of justice. His expertise is reading clues written in blood.
That's called medium velocity.
He's not afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. Like any substance, blood is affected by gravity and momentum. Every kind of bloodshed leaves behind characteristic clues. Stabbing will create a dripping pattern. The relatively low velocity of the weapon doesn't propel blood too far from the source. A speeding bullet, on the other hand, creates a bloody mist. And a bludgeoning wound produces large spatters that can spray far. By examining the tiny tails behind each drop of blood, Lee can determine the position of the victim and the amount of force used to create the injury. From this, and from the size of the wound, he can determine the type of weapon used and deduce the circumstances of a person's death. Lee is perhaps most famous for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial. He's also helped identify victims in mass graves in Bosnia.
She was in fact.
As soon as Lee received the photos taken from the Matheson case, he pored over them and became suspicious. He felt he was definitely looking at a crime scene.
After I received the photograph, did the detailed examination, my initial reaction, something is wrong with this case. Some foul play took place inside the van.
From the photographs of the driver's side window, Lee could tell that the blood at the front of the van was spattered at medium velocity, suggesting blunt force trauma. It appeared the victim was struck multiple times. The bloodstains on the window also contradicted Matheson's assertion that his wife dived out of it.
At the time of incident, this window was up. Approximately 200 medium velocity blood spatter was noticed in this area alone.
Lee needed to see the van firsthand to trace the trajectory of the spatter. Strings were connected to each droplet to determine their common point of origin. It turned out to be the driver's seat area, about the height where a person's head would be. Lee's findings showed the damage was inflicted before she left the vehicle. The photos from the autopsy showed that the victim's head had sustained enough damage to kill her. Once Dr. Lee determined that a struggle had occurred in the van, investigators knew that Ken Matheson was lying. His motive for killing his wife was probably money.
If she died in an accident, he would be paid $595,000, and if she died in an automobile-related accident, he would be paid $675,000.
Sir, step out of the car. Put your hands up. Keep your hands where I can see them. Face down on the ground. Come on, over here in the ground. Face down. Move it. Face down.
Based on the evidence, Ken Matheson was arrested on his day off. Police pieced together the murder. While Yvonne was driving, Ken Matheson struck her with a blunt object. She probably stopped the vehicle, or he gained control and brought it to a stop. He continued beating her to the brink of death. Marks on her hands suggested she had tried to defend herself. In the dark, Matheson probably didn't realize he was leaving the blood spatters that would be his undoing. Once he was sure that his wife wouldn't survive, he carried her out of the van and ran over her. He carried her back into the van and waited for someone to stop and call for help.
We had, a gut feeling and a lot of suspicions. We didn't have any hard evidence. So Dr. Lee's blood spatter analysis is what gave us our first piece of really hard evidence.
In 1995, Ken Matheson was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and murder. He's not eligible for parole for 25 years. Sometimes a coroner's findings can only tell part of the story. When that happens, forensic criminalists like Dr. Lee give a voice to the victims who would otherwise be silenced forever.
Victim died. She cannot testify. Physical evidence speak for her.
Matheson's simple but gruesome crime was undone by some forensic details that he just didn't count on. But can the same forensic science that proves murder also be used to prove that no murder was committed? Experts in New York State hoped it could. The town of Munnsville in central New York is one of those quiet, picturesque places that blends unnoticed into the landscape as motorists rush past. In June 1990, it became an unlikely battleground for a most unlikely soldier. The trouble started in a shabby farmhouse outside of town. Delbert Ward, 59, awoke at dawn to milk his cows. He'd tried earlier to awaken his brother, William, but he didn't move. William hadn't been feeling well lately. Delbert thought it best to let him sleep. Delbert would take care of the chores without him today. The four Ward brothers were quiet and simple-minded. They'd spent their entire lives on the dairy farm. It was their universe, all they had and all they knew. Reclusive and childlike, the brothers even shared their bed, probably as they had done since boyhood. William, the oldest, was also the smartest and strongest. He ran the show. Delbert was his right-hand man. The other brothers, Roscoe and Lyman, occasionally pitched in to help out. But on this day, June 6th, Delbert was on his own. Even after he finished his chores, he couldn't wake brother William. Something was wrong. Delbert called his brothers. The men didn't know what to do. Because the Ward brothers had no phone, Delbert and Roscoe walked to a neighbor's house to call for help. Their fourth brother, Lyman, watched after William until it arrived. 20 minutes after Delbert placed the call, state troopers and the Madison County coroner appeared at the farm. William's body was examined. No signs of foul play were noted. It seemed that 64-year-old William died peacefully in his sleep. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office, while police interviewed the surviving brothers. In the following days, the brothers tried to get on with their work. It would be difficult without Brother Bill.
Won't give you too much at once. Spill it on yourself.
Delbert's life would be much harder, and his troubles were just beginning. At William's autopsy, the assistant medical examiner took tissue samples and careful notes. No indicators of natural disease were noted in the report. However, something unusual demanded attention. Pinpoint-size hemorrhages in William's eyes, mouth, and windpipe. These tiny spots, called petechial hemorrhages, can have a number of causes. Often, it's the first tip-off to death by suffocation. The assistant medical examiner couldn't rule out death by unnatural means. On the death certificate, cause of death was listed as pending further study. The district attorney was contacted and told the case was bothersome. And here's where communication apparently began to break down. The message was passed along to the state police, and the suspicions about the petechial hemorrhages became garbled along the way. Now, the possibility of homicide became a certainty. Delbert was taken to the station for questioning. He was interviewed for 4 hours.
Isn't it true that you had something to do with him being sick?
His interrogation was not recorded.
I am answering his questions.
According to attorney Ralph Cognetti in Albany, New York, Delbert was confused by all the attention. He only wanted to return to the farm, so he was soon willing to say anything. He signed the confession.
Tell them what they want to hear and they'll let you go home, and that's in fact what they said to him. They certainly didn't let him go home after he confessed. But if you have an opportunity to read the confession, it really sounds like a Harvard dissertation, and you know, certainly inside, that that did not come from Delbert's lips.
Nevertheless, the confession, coupled with the autopsy results, were enough to arrest Delbert. Later, a grand jury handed up an indictment against him for second-degree murder. To the people of Munnsville, population 400, it was absurd to think that Delbert would or could have killed his brother. They believed the state had it all wrong. When his bail was set at $10,000, the whole town chipped in and raised the money in a matter of hours. The kindness of the neighbors and the plight of Delbert Ward earned an article in the New York Times. The groundswell of support for Delbert began to grow. A friend of the Wards brought Ralph Cognetti into the case. Based on his conversation with Delbert, Cognetti was convinced of his client's innocence. A review of the evidence suggested that the homicide charge was based more on Delbert's confession than on the physical evidence from the medical examiner's office. As Cognetti was putting his defense together, he received a fateful call. The man identified himself as Cyril Wecht. The name meant nothing to Cognetti.
Here was a gentleman who explained that he was a forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh, and that he had read the article, read the story about the boys, and was willing to review whatever evidence we had without any cost to us.
In other words, what you're telling me is...
Dr. Cyril Wecht's reputation spreads far beyond the walls of the coroner's office in Pittsburgh, where he works as the chief forensic pathologist for Allegheny County. He's helped investigators on the assassination of Robert Kennedy and has consulted in the death of Elvis Presley. Besides degrees in medicine, Wecht also holds a degree in law. He'd read about the Delbert Ward case in the New York Times, and it piqued his interest. He requested William Ward's case file.
After I reviewed the case file, which included the autopsy report, my initial impression was that there was an inadequate basis for any forensic pathologist to conclude that this was an asphyxiation death from suffocation, smothering. There simply were not adequate findings for such a diagnosis.
Using the assistant medical examiner's original notes, Wecht formulated a more mundane diagnosis. William Ward died of heart disease, the #1 killer of men his age in America. The Ward brothers had in fact told authorities that William had been in poor health for years, but he refused to see a physician. His symptoms were consistent with cardiovascular disease, supporting Wecht's theory. But the prosecution believed that William's illness may have provided a motive for his murder. Did Delbert Ward kill his brother William? The state of New York said he did. According to their theory, Delbert suffocated his brother to release him from his failing health. They said that it may have been a mercy killing, but it was murder nonetheless. The prosecution pointed to Delbert's odd behavior on the day of William's death. When Delbert couldn't rouse his brother at the crack of dawn like he normally did, he went about his chores anyhow. To the prosecution, that lack of concern suggested guilt. To Ralph Cognetti, it said more about the realities of life on a farm.
It was a point that the prosecutor jumped on. How could a person who was so concerned about his brother's well-being go and milk cows? What came out at trial, and what I'm sure the jurors knew because we had 1 or 2 dairy farmers on the jury, was that if you don't milk a cow when it needs to be milked, then that cow's going to get very ill.
Cognetti and Cyril Wecht stuck with the idea that William died of natural causes, but they had to prove it. The victim had already been buried. All Wecht had to work from were the autopsy records, those same records and tissue samples that the state claimed showed nothing unusual besides the petechial hemorrhages. That's not how Wecht read them. He was confident that he had everything he needed to prove Ward's innocence. According to the thin tissue samples gathered at William Ward's autopsy, along with the medical examiner's data, William's heart was enlarged and his coronary arteries suffered a blockage of 20%. His right lung was heavily scarred and weighed twice as much as his left. His liver and spleen also were enlarged. Without a drastic change in habits, death by heart disease seemed inevitable for William. But Wecht had to undermine the prosecution's assertion that he was murdered to be relieved of his suffering. Though Wecht had only photographs and tissue samples of William Ward to work from, he called upon his vast experience on other cases, where he had examined the bodies directly. He noted the petechiae, the telltale red hemorrhages found in the victim's eyes and mouth. To the state, these were clear signs of strangling. They eclipsed all other symptoms. While it's true that petechial hemorrhages can indicate smothering, they're not enough to prove it beyond a doubt. Unless a person is somehow incapacitated before he's smothered, the body will likely show signs of a struggle. William Ward's did not.
No injuries around the mouth, in the mouth, and the tongue, the gums. No injuries on or around the neck. No evidence of increased fluidity of the blood. No evidence of increased blueness of the blood. No aspiration of gastric contents that will occur as a person struggles. So we had none of it.
For the defense, there was no evidence of murder. William simply died in his sleep of heart disease. The homicide charge was the result of an unfortunate series of miscommunications that had grown out of control.
or you can take the incident seen by one person and then passed on to a second and to a third. And then when you get down to the 6th or the 10th or the 15th, you'll find that that story bears very little relationship to the original creation, to the original version.
Coming into the case as an outsider, Wecht was immune to the preconceptions that Delbert Ward was a murderer. By looking at the case with a fresh perspective, he won Delbert's freedom. On April 5th, 1991, Delbert Ward was acquitted of all charges.
It grew like a bomb almost. It started small, and then by the end of the trial, he became what he is today, really a legend, certainly in that part of the state.
Cyril Wecht believes that the situation that Delbert Ward found himself in was not unusual. He's seen many cases that were tainted by a medical examiner's wrong assumptions, an investigator's speedy conclusion, or a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, these errors tend to compound themselves.
We work closely and constantly with homicide detectives, with police, with district attorneys. We hear their versions. Consciously, subconsciously, those versions begin to take hold. And the mind then begins to work. And you build up then your own impressions, ultimately your own opinions and conclusions that fit in best with those.
No matter how mysterious or suspicious a death may appear, the truth can be resurrected in the lab. Every day, the forensic skills of the medical examiner, coroner, and crime scene expert prove that the most important witness to a death is the deceased. A dropped cigarette is the prime suspect in a fatal house fire. But detectives soon realize this is one death that can't be blamed on tobacco. Can they build a murder case on a pile of ashes? A suspicious fire takes the lives of 2 children and pits the parents against each other. The solution to a ghastly crime hangs by a hair. When a restaurant burns to the ground, detectives find all the ingredients for arson. But who cooked up the scheme that left 2 firefighters dead? Searing temperatures and torrents of water are the enemies of crime solving. But even in the blackened rubble, arson investigators can fan a few smoking embers into flames of justice. Around 3 a.m. on November 19, 1994, firefighters were called to the home of Wendy and Lance Wargo in Plymouth, Connecticut. Lance Wargo escaped the fire with his children. Intense heat kept him from rescuing his wife, Wendy, asleep downstairs in the den. The fire burned too fiercely for firefighters to enter the home. Hope for Wendy's survival extinguished long before the blaze. Wargo told firefighters that his wife regularly used the den for smoking and had fallen asleep there the night before. Because the victim was a smoker, investigators had to consider that the fire was started by a dropped cigarette. After the flames were extinguished, investigators found Wendy's charred remains on a sofa in the den. The body was sent to the state medical examiner's office.
This area right here.
Meantime, cause and origin investigators walked the scene. Even though a cigarette seemed the likely cause of the blaze, a full investigation had to be conducted because a death was involved. There were no electrical shorts or gas leaks. There was no indication of break-in, nor anything suspicious. Working from areas of lesser to greater damage, investigators confirmed that the den was the center of the inferno.
Sample that carpet now that we're down to it.
Severe damage to the floor told them that the fire had started just a few feet from where the victim lay. It fit with the theory of a careless cigarette. But the rest of the damage did not. Uniform blackening of the ceiling and walls indicated that the den had reached flashover temperature, a point hot enough to ignite all flammable materials simultaneously. The flames probably burned close to 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. It was unlikely that a smoldering cigarette could have ignited such a raging fire. Beneath the remains of the charred sofa, an unusual burn pattern also seemed to refute the cigarette theory. Furniture usually creates protected areas. But the burn pattern etched into this floor didn't correspond to the placement of the sofa. Cause and origin investigator Kevin McGurk interpreted the damage.
The tongue groove wood floor was burned in a very straight line with specific lines of demarcation, holes burned straight down through the floor, that I believe the only thing that could have created that was the result of the introduction of a liquid accelerant.
In the hopes of finding the accelerant, samples of the flooring were gathered from around the house and sent to the forensics lab. Technicians looked for any traces of flammable liquids that might still be present in the samples. They capture vapors from the materials and run them through a gas chromatograph. This instrument separates individual chemicals into their basic components, generating a pattern of peaks and valleys that can be compared to the patterns produced by known accelerants. In this case, none of the samples showed any traces of accelerant.
I think, yeah, it should just be plain acetone.
Not a single droplet of flammable residue could be identified. The negative results didn't mean that an accelerant hadn't been used. A flashover usually consumes everything in its path, especially combustible liquids. While arson investigators continued searching the home for evidence, the medical examiner took a look at the body. In Connecticut, any victim of accidental death not witnessed by a physician must be autopsied. Because the body was burned beyond recognition, dental records were used to confirm that the victim was Wendy Wargo. The next task was to determine cause of death. In deaths associated with fire, medical examiners pay close attention to the respiratory tract. According to Malka Shah, fire victims normally breathe in smoke and soot.
That inhaled stuff can go into your nose, into your mouth, throat, and all the way to the lung. In contrast, in Wendy's case, there was no soot present beyond first few millimeters of her tongue.
Blood analysis also had unexpected results. Fire victims usually have large amounts of carbon monoxide in their bloodstream. Wargo barely had any. The victim hadn't taken a single breath of smoky air. There was only one explanation. Before the fire started, Wendy Wargo was already dead. Wendy, a 29-year-old Plymouth native, had been married to Lance, a chemical engineer, for 9 years.
Did you get a call?
Her friends and co-workers described her as a devoted mother and a warm, giving person.
All right. How's my boy? You ticklish today?
Finding out how this young woman died would require the process of elimination. Shaw analyzed the victim's blood for drugs, alcohol, and poisons. She studied the internal organs. She searched the skull and bones for injury. She found nothing out of the ordinary.
In Wendy's case, I was able to eliminate all other causes of death. She has not died of a fire, she had not died of natural disease or any stab wound or a gunshot wound or bludgeoned to death.
But that didn't rule out a homicide. Because the skin and outer tissue had been burned away, there was no way to tell if she had been strangled or smothered. The unaccountable death and suspicious blaze pointed to murder, but there was no proof and little hope that any would be found. Subtle clues rarely survive a fire. Finding a smoking gun in the burned-out den seemed unlikely to Detective John Buterla.
In a fire scene, you have firefighters who are concerned with a number of things, including getting in there, looking for any victims that they can possibly bring out. They don't have a regard for the fact that there may be a crime there. So they're dumping tens of thousands of gallons of water. They're bringing hoses and personnel inside a structure in order to fulfill their obligation.
It appeared that no additional clues had survived the fire and water. Although investigators continued to examine the burned home, it seemed they would have to rely on good old-fashioned detective work if they wanted to find out what really happened on the night of the fire. Police questioned the Wargo's neighbors at the fire scene.
Across the street over there.
None could offer any leads as to who might want to kill Wendy Wargo. Lance Wargo told investigators that a smoke detector had awakened him. He rescued his 2 children from their beds and escaped the burning home. But he couldn't get to Wendy. He was lauded for his brave rescue attempt. And yet one odd detail overshadowed his heroics.
The actual night of the fire, it struck a number of people, including all the investigators who worked on this case, that Lance Wargo at 3:30 in the morning came out of the house fully clothed. Most people, 3:30 in the morning, they're going to come out of the house. They're certainly not going to come out dressed the way he was.
Yeah, I'd fallen asleep while I was watching TV, and I got...
When they wondered, but he found the time to button his shirt and tie his shoes.
I went back for her, but I couldn't normally sleep with the shoes on. I fell asleep in the shoes.
Lance's spit and polish image was beginning to smudge. Police looked a little more closely into Wendy Wargo's domestic life.
I've had a hard day, Wendy.
They learned that she had served her husband with divorce papers just 18 days before her death. Lance was overheard saying that he would rather murder his wife than give up his kids. He was now the prime suspect, but police had no tangible evidence. To find out if his imminent divorce was worth killing over, investigators obtained a search warrant and went to the motel where Wargo was staying with his children. They collected the clothing that he had been wearing on the night of the fire.
These the jeans you're wearing that night?
Finding a trace of blood or some accelerant residue was investigators' only chance of tying the suspect to the crime. In the lab, the clothes were tested, but the results were disappointing. Investigators found nothing unusual on them. Though a spotlight of suspicion glared on Lance Wargo, there wasn't a shred of proof. the investigation had reached a dead end. Either he was completely innocent, as he asserted, or he had just committed a nearly perfect murder. Weeks after the blaze, fire investigators turned the house over to Lance Wargo's insurance company to assess the damages.
So you've got, as far as the water pump, maybe verify.
It seemed as though Wargo was in the clear and about to get a healthy settlement.
All right, so that wouldn't matter anyway.
Then, insurance investigators found a singed notepad in the Wargo's bedroom that the fire investigators had missed.
This was the list you recovered.
On it were several pages of cryptic notes. Investigators examined the lists of abbreviations. CIGS, they believed, was cigarettes. There were references to rope, gloves, a mask, dry run. It was like a murder plot in shorthand. Among the notes were abbreviations for household chemicals that could be used as accelerants.
All along, something about cigarettes.
Investigators went back to the home to see if they could find any evidence of these chemicals. In Wargo's garage, they found one kind. In the house, they found a melted bottle of another. Investigators had found the lethal ingredients for the accelerant. The writing in the notebook further incriminated Lance Wargo and suggested that he pre-planned the so-called accident. A final examination of the home caught Wargo in another critical lie. He had told investigators that he was awakened by a smoke detector. Damage to the wiring inside the detector led investigators to believe that couldn't possibly have happened.
Well, a subsequent examination by an electrical engineer or a professional engineer made the determination the smoke detectors are probably not working in proper working order at the time of the fire.
Lance Wargo was arrested and charged with murder, first-degree arson, 2 counts of risk of injury to a minor, and tampering with physical evidence. He was held on $1 million bail. Detectives learned that just days before the fire, Wargo had participated in a fire safety course for work. It appeared that he had applied this knowledge, along with his expertise in chemistry, to plan and execute a murder cover-up. A battle between the Wargos culminated in Lance putting his carefully formulated plan into action. First, he suffocated his wife. Then he set the fire to conceal the murder. As suggested in his notebook, he would drop hints that cigarettes had caused the fire.
The motive, I believe, is a spite revenge fire motive. He was going through a divorce. He did not want a divorce. He did not want to be a weekend father. These were items that were noted in the notepad as well.
The bereaved husband was found guilty of 6 charges in connection with Wendy Wargo's death. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Lance Wargo had nearly succeeded in blaming his fire on a cigarette. But even in blatant cases of arson, finding the perpetrator might not be so obvious. Shortly after midnight on October 24, 1995, a 911 call summoned the Johnson County, Kansas Fire Department to a luxury home burning out of control. The owner, Dr. Deborah Green, and her 10-year-old daughter Kate had escaped the fire. But 13-year-old Tim and 6-year-old Kelly were still trapped inside. Firefighters' first priority was to rescue the children. But this would be a difficult fire to penetrate. Flames engulfed nearly half the home, burning through the roof and out the windows of the second floor. The only way to get in was through the basement. Thick smoke met them as they attempted to climb to the first floor. Not far into their search of the basement rooms, the floors above started falling. If they stayed much longer, they too would be consumed. Captain Maurice Mott had no choice but to pull his men out.
We had fire coming through the roof and several of the windows throughout the first and second floor of the residence. We were concerned of a complete structure collapse.
Mott and his crew conceded that the children could not be alive. To spare Green and her daughter the trauma of watching the deadly fire, investigators brought them to the Prairie Village Police Station. Green told police that shortly after midnight, she went to sleep in the master bedroom on the first floor. An alarm woke her. She opened her bedroom door to find the hallway consumed by smoke and fire. She said she closed the door and exited onto the deck. She heard her son calling for help through the intercom, but couldn't reach him.
All of a sudden, the smoke alarm.
Green told him to stay in his room and wait for help.
I heard the smoke alarm going off.
Like her mother, Kate had awakened to the fire alarm. Seeing thick black smoke coming from the hallway, she escaped through her bedroom window. She crawled onto the garage roof and jumped to safety. Her brother and sister never made it out of their beds. At 5 a.m., after the fire was extinguished, firefighters recovered the bodies of Kelly and Tim. Their remains were sent for autopsy.
I want to get some pictures first.
The medical examiner determined that both had died from carbon monoxide poisoning due to smoke inhalation. The fire that had taken their lives had been very hot and fast-moving. Within an hour of ignition, it had consumed much of the roof and reduced the inside to a charred skeleton.
The reason we call the task force
The size of the home, the high degree of damage, and the double fatalities were beyond the scope of the city's resources. Prairie Village authorities activated a task force of law enforcement, fire, and investigative officials from counties in Kansas and Missouri. Cause and origin investigators examined the burned-out home. Gary Lamons, division chief of Johnson County, realized this wouldn't be an easy fire to pinpoint.
As they went through, the whole area had to be excavated and layered through. All the debris that was on the floor had to be sifted through, and as you go through that, it's taken to the outside.
Looking through the debris, investigators found that unlike most fires, Many rooms of this house seem to have burst into flames at the same time. And unlike most fires, this one didn't burn up and out. Patterns on the standing walls told investigators that it climbed straight up very rapidly. They examined and photographed every room of the 6,000 square foot home. Forensic chemist Bill Chapin knew that this was no ordinary house fire.
You had a massive burning in the kitchen, and then not so much burning in the eating portion of the kitchen, and then massive burning in the living room, and no burning in the master bedroom, and massive burning in portions of other parts of the house. It was a hodgepodge of nonsense that you just wouldn't see in a normal, typical fire.
Such disparities made sense only if these heavily damaged areas had been doused with accelerant. The amount of damage and odd flow of the fire suggested arson. But first, the task force needed to rule out accidental causes. The gas lines were in working order. Electrical engineers determined that none of the wiring had shorted. As they excavated the rubble, investigators noticed deep pitting and scaly damage called alligatoring. It proved that they were looking at pore patterns made by a liquid accelerant. It wouldn't take much digging to turn up the source of the fire. Whoever set it had not hidden the fuel. Bottles of antifreeze, charcoal lighter fluid, and alcohol were found throughout the house. "48 samples were collected. They were sent to the lab and tested. In numerous carpet swatches, investigators found trace amounts of charcoal lighter fluid. If antifreeze and alcohol had also been used, they probably would have burned off. The presence of accelerant now proved arson. Because of the family's affluence, detectives wondered if the fire had been set to cover up a burglary. But there was no forced entry. The burglar alarm was in working order. The bolts were all in the locked position. The only damage to doors and windows had been caused by firefighters. Whoever set the deadly fire had been inside the house or had a key. Investigators determined that arson had destroyed Dr. Deborah Green's home and killed 2 of her children. Now they had to determine who set the deadly blaze. While the task force continued excavating the house, detectives investigated its former occupants. Police again questioned Deborah Green. Together for 18 years, Green and her husband Mike Farrar had both been successful physicians.
Can I go to Bill's house? I'll be home by 6. I'll see you later.
After the birth of their 3rd child, she gave up her practice to be a full-time mother.
Have fun. Bye.
Over the years, the marriage grew unhappy. 3 months before the fire, Farrar said he wanted a divorce and admitted he'd been having an affair. The family began to crumble. Green told police that shortly before going to bed on the night of the fire, she and her estranged husband had fought on the phone.
Appreciate you coming down here. Just have
Police brought Farrar into the station for further questioning.
Coffee would be nice, thank you. Can we get some coffee, please? Sure. I just have a couple questions for you. Can you give me a little bit more detail on what happened?
He told them that on the night of the fire, he had been with his children.
All right.
He dropped them off at the house, then returned to his apartment.
Night. All right.
Simply called my wife.
Telephone records confirmed that Farrar had been at his apartment shortly before midnight, but his actions after that point could not be accounted for.
I shouted back, she shouted
He
back,
quickly
and
pointed the
just
finger at
continued to
Green,
escalate. She liked to
claiming
take
that
her
she
to
was
bed with
mentally
her. I
unstable
hoping that she'd
and was
give
capable of
to
starting the
sleep,
fire.
or should I bring it over? Are there any
Police were skeptical.
during the conversation?
His anger with Deborah Green gave him the motive. His house key gave him the means. But Deborah had equal motive and equal means. Did Mike Farrar sneak in and set fire to the house? Or did Deborah set it to frame her husband and play the victim? Only the evidence left at the scene could determine the truth. As they continued excavating, investigators uncovered a trail of pour patterns that wound through the house and ended at the threshold of Deborah Green's bedroom. Deborah had said that her door was closed during the fire. She said she ran out the back door when she saw the smoke. But investigators had found traces of lighter fluid in her bedroom carpet. Forensic chemist Bill Chapin felt the evidence told a different story.
You could see that accelerant pattern coming through the hallway and into the doorway area. That accelerant had soaked, if you will, up into the carpet underneath where that door was standing open.
Fire dissipation.
Not only did the accelerant trail lead into her bedroom, the burn pattern on the carpet could not have been created with the door closed.
You got back. Were there any children out?
The clues at the doorway suggested Deborah's guilt, but the case was by no means open and shut. The team needed more evidence to determine which spouse was responsible for the fire that killed their children. Investigators came up with a plan. The accelerant had been poured so densely throughout the house that it probably created a burst of flame at ignition.
Okay, right there.
It was possible that whoever lit the fire had been burned. Neither Green nor Farrar had suffered any apparent injuries. But some burns can only be detected with a microscope. Investigators took hair samples from both Deborah Green and Mike Farrar. Under a microscope, Farrar's hair showed no sign of fire damage. Green's strands, however, had been badly singed. Chapin ran a number of tests to rule out any other cause for the singeing.
We did some testing to see what kind of temperatures would be involved with causing hair to singe to the extent that hers was singed, and trying to heat hair and bring it, within so many inches of direct heat, heating it with irons, heating it in different kinds of ways to see what the different kinds of singeing would tell us.
Only direct contact with flame could have damaged her hair in that manner. Green had told police that she'd never gotten near any flames. Forensics proved her statement false. Green's lies had finally caught up with her. Police had found the arsonist. From the chaotic crime scene, the task force pieced together a desperate and deadly act. Green had been at her wit's end over her relationship with her husband. The impending divorce was the spark that ignited her fury. The dining room table that she doused with alcohol and other accelerants had been covered with their legal papers. Throughout the house, she focused on places meant to cause emotional pain to Mike Farrar: his piano, his desk, and, most tragically, his children. By saturating the upstairs hallway, she had intentionally closed off their main means of escape. Police summoned Green to the station under the pretense of needing her help with the ongoing investigation. When she arrived, they arrested her. The task force would never be able to fully comprehend the rage that had caused a once brilliant doctor to kill her children. But their astute fire scene reconstruction assured that Deborah Green would pay for her crime. Based on the overwhelming forensic evidence, Green pled guilty rather than go to court.
I think she knew, they knew, she and her lawyers, when they saw the amount of information that we had collected, physical evidence, that she didn't have a chance to win that case.
Deborah Green is serving a life sentence. In Deborah Green's case, a woman's burning rage sparked an unspeakable crime. But cold greed can also fuel a fire. September 2nd, 1991. Shortly after midnight, a motorist in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, saw smoke pouring out of a restaurant. He called the fire department. Within 5 minutes, fire trucks arrived to find Stormy's Seafood Steak and Lounge engulfed in flames. Fires can be unpredictable, and this one was especially treacherous. Intense heat and flashovers thwarted firefighters' efforts. The fire grew out of control. Thick, billowing smoke filled the building. It soon engulfed and disoriented a group of experienced firefighters sent in to find the source of the blaze. Separated from their colleagues, 2 firefighters searched in vain for a way out of the inferno. They ran out of air and died. A burning restaurant had become a death trap for 2 firefighters. The next morning, investigators arrived on the scene to find out how it happened. Captain Ron McCardle of the Florida State Fire Marshal's Office observed a peculiar pattern.
Once I started my preliminary walk around on the exterior, I noticed soot patterns and heat patterns on the concrete block were very high on the wall. This indicated to me that there was a very hot fire high on the interior.
Fires usually start low and work their way up. The markings told McCardle that wasn't the case here. Most of the roof was completely burned away, with less damage below. To determine the cause of a blaze, a fire investigator must sift through remains layer by layer, unearthing a timeline. As a fire rages, burning debris from the ceiling and roof tumbles downward. The debris on the top of the pile was much finer than the rubble it covered, confirming that the top of the building had burned the longest and hottest.
Yeah, well,
Stormy's restaurant was the venture of a man named Biff Utter, who had owned it for 3 years. It did most of its business during the summer. The tragedy had struck just as the season was winding down. When Utter had been at the restaurant earlier that evening, everything seemed fine. He finished up his business, then left with his girlfriend for a party. The restaurant had closed around 11:45, just after the last customers left.
Ready to go?
Utter's mother locked up. The employees didn't see, hear, or smell anything unusual, either inside or outside of the building. But within 15 minutes, flames consumed the restaurant. Because firefighters had been killed in the blaze, it became a federal matter. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms joined the investigation. They agreed with local authorities that the fire had to have started above the ceiling. These unusual conditions spelled death for the 2 firefighters who were caught unaware.
In their traveling through this area, they basically lost their orientation from where they were. The fire was actually above them all the time, every place they were in there. When a fire burns up high, it's very hot and right below the ceiling. And there's a layer of smoke right below it. So the firemen couldn't see it was there. They had no indication it was there. They tried several times to get out. We found their tools and where they tried to mark on the wall in an effort to try to find an exit.
Fire investigators began by ruling out accidental causes. They paid strict attention to wiring and gas pipes that ran through the ceiling, but none showed signs of malfunction. The water heater, the ovens, and the grill were all in working order. Oddly, though, the fire alarm system hadn't been set that night. Lacking a reasonable explanation, all indications were pointing to arson. Accidental fires and arson fires are 2 very different creatures. Accidental fires start slowly.
It's going to start smoldering. It takes time to build up, cause heat, and then as it builds and builds and builds, it moves upward at that point, upward and out. That's why we look for different V patterns and things on walls. And they're how we track fires.
But investigators found other kinds of markings. Irregular scars that told them the fire had moved very fast. Instead of consuming materials as it went, it flared up and jumped across beams. Natural fires don't behave that way. This one had to have been fed with an accelerant. Someone had started this fire intentionally and killed 2 people in the process.
Mr. Utter, be careful in here.
The first suspect was the proprietor, Biff Utter. But Utter had nothing to gain from the fire and everything to lose.
Okay, over here was a
Business had been lagging. He told investigators that he'd been forced to let his fire insurance lapse a few months earlier.
Gotta be careful where you step.
Utter couldn't think of anyone who would want to torch his place, nor could investigators find any sign of forced entry. In the hunt for clues, insulation collected from the scene was analyzed for the presence of an accelerant. The pattern of peaks and valleys from the chromatograph revealed the presence of a flammable petroleum product, most likely kerosene. While it was one more piece of evidence that pointed to arson, the accelerant was too common to be traced back to anyone.
Let's check this off.
Unless investigators could find some clue in the rubble, they had little hope of identifying the arsonist.
I'll look over on this side, see what I can find.
By pouring the accelerant high, where flames burned the hottest, he had nearly succeeded in burning away the evidence. But he hadn't destroyed it all.
Hey, bub, I think I found something. Might be important. Looks like some kind of
Arson investigators searching the burned-out restaurant pulled their most promising clue from a garbage can in Biff Utter's office. They uncovered an opened envelope addressed to Biff Utter, along with a copy of the renewed fire insurance policy for Stormies. But Utter had claimed that he had no insurance. The business owner had been caught in a lie. U.S. Attorney Paul Byron, in charge of prosecuting the double homicide, checked to see if Utter might have burned the building for the insurance money.
When we reviewed his financial records from his own accountant, we found that Stormies was losing about $6,500 per month, and that he was unable to pay the mortgage for the last 3 months the business was open.
Though Utter maintained a lavish lifestyle, he hadn't paid bills in months. Employees weren't getting regular paychecks. Vendors would deal with him only on a cash basis.
I'm gonna have to quit. I'm not getting another job.
The mortgage holder was planning to foreclose. Police spoke with the owner of the building. They learned that Utter had, in fact, stopped paying insurance on the business.
Last time that you talked to Mr. Utter and asked him if he had
But the
insurance.
owner told police she wasn't about to leave the building uninsured.
Okay.
Mr. Utter.
After several attempts to get the money out of Utter, she paid his premiums. She told police that shortly before the fire, she gave Utter a copy of the renewed policy. He personally stood to gain $200,000 if the restaurant burned. To try to pin down Utter's whereabouts on the night of the fire, investigators talked with Utter's girlfriend.
How long have you been forced to go? Let you enforce?
She confirmed that she had been with him when the fire broke out.
Had you guys been together?
There was even documentation to prove it. The call police placed to Utter that evening to inform him that his restaurant had burned had been recorded.
So his presence away from the restaurant was absolute, and we knew that was going to be a tremendous stumbling block in proving who set the fire. It also cued us to the fact that he had to have an accomplice who set the fire because he could not personally have done it.
The insurance provided investigators with a motive to burn the restaurant, but the evidence could not identify the arsonist.
Mr. Utter, I have a warrant for your arrest for arson.
Biff Utter was arrested on June 23, 1994.
Interstate mail fraud. The evidence officer, please.
Prior to his trial, investigators spoke to his cellmate in jail. They hoped he might have revealed something. He did talk, but he didn't say much. Utter didn't name names, but as one inmate testified, he'd confessed to having been involved.
The cellmate testified at trial that Biff Utter stated he would never cooperate with the government, he would never tell them who started the fire, that he was going to attack our forensic evidence because that's really all we had.
But as it turned out, the forensics was more than enough to make the case. Prosecutors theorized that Utter paid a professional arsonist to burn down Stormies so that he could claim the $200,000 insurance money. Utter arranged for the fire alarm to be unarmed and established a solid alibi with his girlfriend. Minutes after the employees left the restaurant, the arsonist entered. By introducing the accelerant into the ceiling, he attempted to build a blaze so big and violent that it would obliterate all traces of the crime. He and Utter underestimated the forensics team's ability to fight fire with fire. A jury convicted Utter of conspiracy, arson, and using fire to commit a federal felony offense. He refused to identify the arsonist. Utter was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His accomplice may still be setting deadly fires. While their actions present an unequal challenge to law enforcement, arsonists are no longer protected by the wake of confusion they leave behind. Using the latest in forensic techniques, investigators have turned the tables on these criminals, fighting their deadly blazes with flames of justice. In Texas, a raging fire turns a couple's home into a death chamber. Investigators believe it's arson, but they'll need an expert to sniff out the truth. After a student in Illinois disappears, police fear that she's the victim of a murder. The crime scene may have gone cold, but at least one tracker is still hot on the trail. Detectives in Tennessee suspect that a missing persons case has turned into a homicide. To make their case, they must rely on canine detectives to dig up the truth. When plotting a murder, a clever killer will do anything to cover his tracks. But not all clues can be concealed. When investigators lose sight of their prey, it falls upon a special breed of dog to pick up the scent of the kill. On June 8, 1994, around 3:15 a.m., a pizza delivery man in the rural community of Belleville, Texas, was on his way home after working the late shift. He spotted a man pulling out of the driveway of a burning house. The driver flagged down the delivery man. He identified himself as Charles Fitz. Fitz said his wife was trapped inside their burning home. He begged the delivery driver to call 911. By the time the fire department arrived, intense flames and heat consumed the home. As long as the fire burned out of control, firefighters could only battle the blaze from the outside. Inside, chances for Francis Fitz's survival vanished with the rest of the couple's home. Emergency medical technicians arrived to treat Charles Fitz. Disoriented and upset, he blamed the fire on the cheap wiring that ran through their home. With difficulty breathing, Fitz was transported to the hospital for treatment of smoke inhalation. By the time the flames were extinguished, some 3 hours later, the house was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Somewhere inside was the body of Francis Fitz. detectives began their routine investigation into the cause and origin of the deadly fire. They started with a visit to Charles Fitz, who was recovering in the hospital. Fitz told them that he'd fallen asleep that night on the sofa. In the early morning hours, he woke up to a house filled with smoke. He tried to get to the bedroom to save Frances, his wife of 17 years. But the smoke and flames were too intense. He'd tried repeatedly to get back into the house, breaking several windows in the process. But all of his rescue attempts failed. It was a harrowing account. But to investigators at the Austin County Sheriff's Department, the story was at odds with Fitz's physical condition. Sheriff's Deputy Richard Holloman explains.
According to what he was telling us, there should have been, some burn marks on his arms, his face, and should have singed hair, but of which he had none.
The next morning, investigators proceeded to the fire scene. Frances Fitz was found in what used to be the couple's bedroom. Her charred remains were transported to the morgue. The medical examiner would later confirm that the cause of death was smoke inhalation. Investigators began processing the burned-out wreckage. Looking to confirm Fitz's story, they searched for signs of faulty wiring. But there was no evidence of an electrical source to the fire. Neither the gas main nor the water heater had malfunctioned. With the obvious accidental causes ruled out, there remained one possibility. The fire had been intentionally set. Investigators began looking for signs of arson. During their search, investigators found debris with alligator-like patterns on the surface. Wood rarely burns this way unless it is doused with an accelerant, like gasoline or lighter fluid. Finding traces of the fluid would be the first step in proving arson. It appeared, however, that the fire had burned away that evidence. But investigators had another tool in their arsenal. Canines can be trained to sniff out traces of arson that otherwise go undetected by humans. George Cavett of the Houston Police Department teaches dogs to search for flammable liquids called hydrocarbons.
It can be naphtha, alcohol, distilled liquor, brake fluid, anything of that nature. Coleman fuel, charcoal lighter fluid, just a large list of things that puts off the same scent that the dogs can detect.
Okay, good girl, we got that. Good girl, let's check.
The dogs began searching through the remains of Fitz's house.
Back here, fetch it up for me.
Hours of searching passed with no signs of a hit. But then they found something. And the location was just inches from where Frances Fitz's body was discovered.
Good girl. Good girl.
And he worked all areas of the bedroom and came back right to the flooring that the victim was laying on top of and gave me an alert, and right beside of it and on the bed springs and that whole segment.
The samples were placed in sealed cans to preserve whatever vapors remained and sent to the lab. With their suspicions raised, investigators next took the dogs to the police impound lot, where Charles Fitz's truck had been towed. The dogs were given the command to search for traces of accelerant. Again, the dogs alerted police to the presence of hydrocarbons on the gas and brake pedals. They were collected along with the other samples and sent to the lab for analysis. With the help of their canine detectives, investigators had recovered enough evidence for forensic examiners to conduct a thorough analysis.
All right, good girl.
At the lab, a piece of charcoal is inserted into each paint can containing the evidence removed from the scene. Then, the can is heated to just below the boiling point for up to 18 hours. During that time, the charcoal absorbs any hydrocarbon vapors. Any potential hydrocarbon is then removed from the charcoal with the solvent carbon disulfide. The resulting liquid is then analyzed by means of a gas chromatograph. By breaking down the substance into its various components, the gas chromatograph produces a pattern of peaks and valleys. In this case, the known pattern for gasoline came up in 3 of the 13 samples. The 2 from the interior of Charles Fitz's truck, and 1 from the bedroom where the body was found. Thanks to the Accelerant sniffing dogs, the deadly blaze had been exposed as a deliberate act of arson and a homicide. And Charles Fitz, the only other person in the house, was the most likely suspect in his wife's death. Police in Belleville, Texas, investigating the death of Francis Fitz, killed in a house fire, believed they had uncovered a murder. Since he was the only other person in the house, Francis's husband Charles was the prime suspect. Travis Kane, the district attorney of Austin County, began delving into Charles Fitz's background.
The family of Francis Fitz told us that Charles Fitz was a braggart person who really never held a job. He was somebody who wore flashy jewelry, somebody who wore big hats and big boots, who bragged a lot and made a lot of noise about what he was going to do, but never really did anything.
Through family members, police learned that Frances, a secretary, was the breadwinner of the family, even though she struggled with debilitating arthritis.
I thought I just fixed us some spaghetti.
She was dedicated to taking care of Charles and never spoke poorly of him. Though Charles rarely gave anything of himself in return, the marriage seemed solid to outside observers. Having found no obvious marital problems, police struggled to find a motive for the deadly fire. Perhaps in one of Charles's many unsuccessful business ventures, he had made enemies. Someone seeking revenge against him could have set the fire. Detectives decided to take a closer look at some of his former associates. As investigators continued looking for answers, Francis's relatives sifted through the wreckage, looking for any mementos of their lost loved one. During their search, they found some documents that had survived the fire. Among the papers found was a list of overseas phone numbers and several insurance policies on Francis, listing Charles as the beneficiary. Investigators immediately contacted the insurance agent. They learned that Charles Fitz had recently made changes to the policies. In the months before the fire, he had upped the amount of the insurance on Francis's life and on the home. The agent told investigators that Charles Fitz stood to gain $824,000 from the deadly fire. Though the timing of the policy changes was suspicious, it wasn't proof of murder. And investigators still had to rule out the possibility that someone other than Charles Fitz had committed the crime. But all of Charles's past business associates had been dismissed as potential suspects. Now, investigators had to determine why Charles Fitz would want his dedicated and supportive wife dead. For answers, they turned to the only other piece of evidence that survived the fire. One of the overseas phone numbers led investigators to a young Englishwoman named Tracy Munns, who was living in the Philippines. Tracy reluctantly told investigators that she had had an affair with Charles Fitz while she attended college in Texas. She claimed that they planned to marry after she graduated. Charles had agreed to leave his wife. But Tracy grew frustrated when Charles didn't keep up his end of the bargain. She moved to the Philippines and tried to cut ties. Charles wouldn't let it go.
Then in June of '94, he called her and said, "My wife is gone. I'm free to come down to you." And she said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with you." And that was the last time she spoke to Charles Fitz.
By killing his wife, investigators believed that Charles Fitz was clearing the way to be with his mistress. The insurance payoff would give him enough money to start a new life overseas. Though Tracy Munns had provided investigators with a possible motive, they needed to find proof that Fitz had planned his wife's murder. Poring over the suspect's financial records, investigators learned that Charles Fitz had sold his second car, a Mercedes, shortly after the fire. Though it didn't seem like much of a clue, they tracked down the classified ad and the man who bought the car. To investigators, the language of the ad was telling. It read, "1983 Mercedes, must sell, leaving country." The man who bought the car said that during the sale, Fitz told him that he was unmarried. The ad and the information from the car buyer, in addition to the arson uncovered by the Accelerant sniffing dogs, was enough for investigators to arrest Charles Fitz for murder. Detectives theorized that Charles Fitz believed he had everything to gain from torching his house and killing his wife. Not only would it give him a huge amount of money, it would clear the way for him to be with his young lover. But he would be disappointed. 1 week after the fire, Fitz proposed to Tracy, only to find that she'd already married someone else. On February 2nd, 1996, Charles Fitz was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. By picking up the scent of arson, dogs in Texas brought a killer to justice. But in the Midwest, police couldn't prove a murder had been committed until they got some help finding the victim. On March 5th, 1987, a distraught father contacted the Champaign, Illinois Police Department. Ludwig Warner believed his 22-year-old daughter Karen was missing. It was a Thursday, and he hadn't seen her or her car since Monday morning. Her purse, wallet, and eyeglasses were also gone. His daughter frequently spent the night at friends' homes, but she'd never been gone for this long without checking in. The next day, detectives questioned Karen Warner's friends. Like the young woman's father, none of them had seen her in 4 days.
Lisa, I really do appreciate
One close friend told investigators that over the last week she hadn't noticed anything unusual about Karen's behavior. Though Karen had recently lost her job, she was looking forward to resuming her college career in the fall. Karen hadn't mentioned any plans to travel. But that didn't mean that she hadn't taken an unexpected trip. In fact, Karen had recently been getting calls from an ex-boyfriend named Curly B. Lee. He wanted to rekindle the romance, but Karen was planning to tell him in person that she wasn't interested. Curly had become too possessive and physically abusive. But it was possible that Karen had a change of heart. During their time as a couple, Karen and Curly frequently took on planned vacations. Investigators at the Champaign Police Department believed there was a reasonable explanation for Karen's disappearance. Sergeant Jim Luking explains.
She was gone, he was gone, and her car was gone. It could very well have been that they decided to go off together, which wouldn't be all that unusual for two people to decide to do that.
To find out, investigators paid a visit to Curly Lee. When they were led into his rooming house, they found that Curly and his clothes were gone. And nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Karen's family didn't buy it. Desperate for answers, they urged the media to get involved. Hoping to generate a lead, pictures of Karen, her car, and of Curly were published in the area newspapers, along with details of her disappearance. No one responded about Karen, but someone had seen Curly. The caller reported that a friend of hers had driven Curly to the bus station 2 days after Karen's disappearance. Curly said he was heading south to his mother's house in Hughes, Arkansas. Champaign police contacted law enforcement in Arkansas and asked them to speak with Curly. Like the rest of Karen's friends, Curly said that he had no idea where his ex-girlfriend could be. He said they had spoken briefly before he left Champaign, but that was just to say goodbye. As investigators struggled to find answers, the family's publicity campaign paid off. A man in Danville, Illinois, 30 miles from Champaign, recognized the photograph of Karen's car. He believed that same car was sitting abandoned in his church parking lot. A check of the license plates confirmed that it was the vehicle registered to the missing woman. If any questions remained about Karen Warner's fate, the discovery of her abandoned car erased them.
That was the first physical evidence that there was something wrong. It would be unusual for her to be there, for her car to be there especially.
Investigators brought the car to the police station for a more detailed forensic examination. But the initial search of the vehicle indicated no obvious signs of a struggle. The car was thoroughly dusted for prints. Technicians collected blue and red fibers found on the floor mats and in the trunk. The items were forwarded to the crime lab for further analysis. Hoping someone had seen how the car ended up in Danville, police turned again to the public for help. And again, the strategy paid off. A woman called police to tell them that she may have seen the car. Police brought her in to identify the vehicle. The woman's name was Rhonda. And like Karen, she too was an ex-girlfriend of Curly Lee's. She recognized the car immediately. Police questioned her further. Rhonda admitted that she had driven the car around the time Karen had been reported missing. But she had no idea that the car belonged to Karen Warner. She told investigators that Curly had called her one night asking for a favor.
He said he was going to return the car to a friend.
He needed to return a car to a friend in Danville and asked her to drive him because he didn't have a license.
You know what was in the bag? Did he get it in?
To Detective Mike Smith, Curly's demeanor sounded suspicious.
What we're trying to do, and a plate is missing. She asked him whose car it was, and he never replied. He never answered. And he told her to avoid certain streets and to drive fast.
Rhonda said that Curly then dropped her off at a bar in Danville. She remembered that he had a grocery bag with him in the car, but she never saw what it contained. Curly explained that he had a few errands to run and told her to wait for him in the bar. He gave Rhonda some money for a drink, then drove away. About 15 minutes later, Curly returned to the bar on foot.
He said that he didn't have a valid
Later that
driver's
night,
license.
he had some friends drive them back to Champaign. Rhonda hadn't heard from Curly since. Investigators suspected that in the 15 minutes that Curly had left Rhonda alone, he would have had time to dispose of Karen's body, which was likely hidden in the trunk. They believed he then abandoned the car in the church parking lot, located just a few blocks away, and then returned to the bar on foot. They now focused their attention to finding Karen Warner's body, and they believed it was in the wooded area behind the bar.
He was only gone long enough that he couldn't have gone very far to place the body anywhere else, so it had to be down there. In our opinion, it had to be down there in the weeds or in the brush or in the river.
But finding a body in this densely wooded area would be difficult. There were no obvious grave sites. And in the cold air, any smell of decomposition had been hampered. After 2 days of searching, the team had reached their limits. But investigators had one more option. They called upon the expertise of Joyce Fairs, a dog handler from nearby Urbana, Illinois. For over 15 years, Fairs and her dogs have volunteered their services to local police and sheriff's departments. Bloodhounds like hers are bred to distinguish the vaguest of scents. The handler has to begin with a scent article. It can be any object the victim has come in contact with. In this case, investigators got a t-shirt and a pillowcase from Karen Warner's bedroom and sealed them in a plastic bag to preserve the scent. Fairs then gave the dog the find command, letting him know his job is to find the source of that same smell.
Check it out.
The bloodhound took Fairs on a twisted route. 3 times he brought her down close to the river, as if someone had carried Karen's body, looking for a place to hide her, then deciding against it. Then the dog led Fairs to a deep ravine. But it would have been difficult for anyone to cross this gorge carrying a body. Investigators knew that the body had to be near. Within 15 minutes, the dog closed in on an area of brush. At first, Joyce thought he'd lost the scent, But then, in a slight depression covered with brush, she caught a glimpse of a red sweater and a human hand. Investigators in Champaign, Illinois struggled to solve the disappearance of 22-year-old Karen Warner. Hidden in a remote wooded area, Joyce Fares and her bloodhound believed they had finally found her.
And then I could see her hand, the back of her right hand. And that's when I shouted for Jim Looking to come. I believed that we'd found her body.
After removing the body, investigators began scouring the area for clues. Nearby, investigators recovered a blue blanket. 100 yards from where the body was found, they discovered a grocery bag like the one Rhonda described. Inside, investigators found shoes, eyeglasses, and a purse. All of the items were collected and sent on to the crime lab.
Okay, hold those for me. Just
Joyce Fares and her dog had uncovered a homicide, and investigators had little doubt that they had found Karen Warner. Using dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of Karen Warner. And a fracture to one of the bones in her throat told him that the young woman had been strangled to death. The lack of defensive wounds and other injuries suggested that Karen had been caught off guard. Now, investigators had to make a murder case. And Karen's ex-boyfriend, Curly B. Lee, was their prime suspect. They turned to the crime lab for help. Examiners confirmed that blue fibers recovered from the victim's clothes matched the fibers from the blue blanket found near the body. Next, the blue fibers from the crime scene and red fibers taken from Karen's sweater were compared against the blue and red fibers found in the trunk of Karen's car. All of the fibers matched. Examiners had proven that Karen Warner had been wrapped in a blanket and then placed in the trunk of her car. And the last person known to have driven the vehicle was Curly B. Lee. Illinois police now had enough evidence to arrest him for murder. But as they headed south to Arkansas to pick him up, they learned from authorities that Curly had fled again. But this time, police quickly tracked him down. By canvassing bus stations, Arkansas police learned that Curly had just purchased a ticket to Palm Beach, Florida. Investigators contacted law enforcement in Palm Beach. They staked out the bus station, waiting for the unsuspecting fugitive to arrive. Curly was arrested and extradited to Illinois. Back in Champaign, investigators confronted Curly with the case they'd built against him. He admitted killing Karen, but claimed it was an accident. All of the evidence suggested otherwise. Police theorized that Curly had tried to rekindle his romance with Karen. But when Karen refused his advances, he erupted into a rage.
He didn't like to lose anything, and he decided that he was going to teach her a lesson. Now, whether he intended to kill her or accidentally killed her, I don't know, but I think if you strangle somebody, you intend to kill them.
After killing her, Curly struggled to come up with a plan to cover up his crime. He collected Karen's belongings in a grocery bag and then searched for a blanket to wrap the body in before carrying her out to the trunk. Later that night, after dropping Rhonda off at the bar, he drove behind the property and searched for a place to get rid of his victim. In an effort to make it appear that Karen had simply taken off, he drove her car to a nearby church and abandoned it. 2 days later, he packed up his belongings and fled to Arkansas. But with Joyce Fares and her bloodhound on his trail, Curley's run quickly came to an end. Curley B. Lee was convicted of murder and concealment of a homicide. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. In the Karen Warner case, the dog had to follow a trail that was 7 days old. To solve a murder in Tennessee, another canine will have to track a scent buried for almost a year. In June of 1996, Ray and Fleeta Holliday went to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for help in finding their 39-year-old daughter, Kathy Beadle.
So tell me what you found out.
In April, they said, they received a letter from her saying that she discovered she had cancer and was headed to a clinic in Toronto for experimental treatment.
Faxes, one of the faxes.
She said that she didn't want any direct contact with them during the therapy. From then on, Kathy communicated only by fax. The typed messages were brief and impersonal, completely out of character for their daughter. Fearing that Kathy might be going through some kind of emotional breakdown, Ray went to Toronto to find his daughter. He got the address off a Father's Day card Kathy had sent the month before. As he approached the front of the treatment center, a panic set in. The address belonged to a run-down and abandoned building. There was no cancer treatment center and no clue to his daughter's whereabouts. Fleeta Holliday added that just before her daughter disappeared, Kathy was considering leaving her husband, Tony Vick. But Kathy had 2 children from a previous marriage to think about. Her first husband had died tragically in a plane crash. As part of the insurance settlement, Kathy received $8,000 a month.
From your daughter, not from your daughter.
Though she had become wealthy as a result, she wanted her kids to have a father figure. But Kathy seemed to have fallen out of love with Tony. And though he made every attempt to get back in her good graces, Kathy didn't want to talk to him. She told her mother that she might need some time to herself in the near future to sort things out.
And the address?
With no evidence suggesting a crime had taken place, investigators at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation believed that Kathy had simply kept her word. But Kathy's parents knew their daughter would not leave her 2 kids behind and disappear without a trace. Desperate for answers, they mounted their own publicity campaign, plastering Kathy's picture all over Tennessee. But the family never heard a word. In February of 1997, nearly a year since Kathy had disappeared, Ray and Fleeta Holliday made one last attempt to get the police involved. They contacted the Knox County Sheriff's Office. They told investigators that a few months back, Kathy's husband, Tony Vick, had also disappeared, claiming he was going to find his wife. He left the children and the couple's home with the Hollidays. They hadn't heard from Tony since. The resulting financial strain forced Ray and Fleeta to sell their daughter's home. But before they did, they wanted to be absolutely sure that there weren't any overlooked clues in the home. Sheriff Tim Hutchinson took the case.
Once we learned that all the events that had occurred prior to us being notified that, number one, she was missing from our jurisdiction, and second, it had been a long period of time. That's hard to follow up and start an investigation when that much time has lapsed.
Investigators processed the empty home, searching for any clues that could help them determine Kathy Beadle's fate. But since the home had been placed on the market, a vast amount of potential evidence had been destroyed. Furniture and belongings had been removed. Floors had been scrubbed. Walls had been painted. For investigator Terry Lee of the Knox County Sheriff's Office, working a cleaned crime scene means looking past the obvious.
For instance, in this situation, the carpet had been vacuumed. That's taken up good forensic evidence such as hair, fiber samples, and so forth that we would normally collect. So you have to look a little bit deeper.
Investigators scrutinized every inch of the home. They processed all of the sink drains in the home using luminol, a chemical that glows in the presence of blood. Traces of blood were found in 3 separate sink traps. The traps were removed and sent to the crime lab. Investigators determined that the blood found in the sink was human. But the samples were too deteriorated for a more comprehensive analysis. Still, the presence of so much blood led detectives to suspect something violent had happened in the couple's home. Investigators in Tennessee struggled to solve the mysterious disappearance of Kathy Beadle, a 39-year-old mother of 2, missing for over a year. After searching her and her husband's vacant home, investigators believed they had uncovered evidence of foul play. They decided to take a closer look at Kathy's husband, Tony Vick. What they found was not encouraging.
And then we learned that Tony Vick's first wife died suspiciously. Some say she slipped and fell and drowned in a bathtub.
Others said that Tony had murdered her. But instead of being charged, Vick turned a profit, earning life insurance payoffs that totaled over $600,000. Investigators now feared that Kathy Beadle met a similar fate. And they believed money was the motive for murder. But investigators were a long way from making their case. They had no body, and their prime suspect, Tony Vick, had also disappeared. Hoping to generate a lead, details of the case were published in area newspapers. The tactic worked. The owner of a local consignment shop called police. She recognized Tony Vick.
They belong to my wife.
The woman stated that a few months back, a man dropped off a lot of expensive clothing. He seemed glum and told her that his girlfriend had just died of cancer. He told the owner that he would return for the check once the clothes had been sold. He never did. The check, made out to Tony Vick, remained unclaimed. For investigators, Tony's statements to the consignment store owner had a very clear meaning.
That tells us that, you know, she's definitely deceased. We just need to keep digging, need to keep looking until we can find her body.
To build their case against Tony Vick, Knox County sheriffs needed to know his every move prior to his disappearance. Investigators tracked down the nanny who took care of his and Kathy's children. She hadn't observed any violence between Kathy and Tony, nor did she notice any sign of struggle in the home following Kathy's disappearance. But she was able to offer investigators an unusual piece of information. She remembered that after Kathy disappeared, Vic scolded her and the kids for playing in the backyard. Investigators suspected that there was another reason for his outburst. They now believed that Kathy Beadle was buried somewhere in her own backyard. A team of forensic investigators went back to Tony and Kathy's vacant house. Now they were looking for a clandestine grave, one that had been dug a year earlier. But after hours of searching, they could find no evidence of a burial site. Unless investigators could find Kathy's body, making a murder case against Tony Vick would be difficult. And they were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. In Tennessee, investigators from the Knox County Sheriff's Department believed their missing person, Kathy Beadle, had been murdered. And they believed her body had been buried somewhere in her backyard. But hours of exhaustive searching yielded no clues. Investigators had one more option. At Knox County's Canine unit, dogs are trained to search for a variety of scents, from narcotics to explosives to fugitives. Working with dogs since 1994, Sergeant Robert Spangler has come to appreciate the animal's ability to pick up where the human senses leave off.
Their sense of smell is 200,000 times to 500,000 times what a human is. And that's basically what they're good for. And if there's any kind of scent there, human or non-human, they're going to pick it up where a human can't, even by looking.
But even Sergeant Spangler had doubts as to whether the dog could detect a body after it had been buried for a year. In March of 1997, he and his dog were brought to Vic's backyard, where he gave his partner the command to search for a human scent. As they approached a pile of wood, he noticed the signs of an alert. The dog was telling them to dig beneath the wood pile. Shortly after they began digging, investigators struck a layer of concrete. Knowing that evidence could be anywhere, they carefully sifted through the soil. As they dug further with their hands, trying not to break the concrete, they realized that the dog had discovered a grave. In the concrete, they could see the outline of a body. Once the cement was carefully removed, they could see the body of a woman wrapped in a sleeping bag and a layer of plastic. The body was sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The medical examiner confirmed through dental records that this was the body of Kathy Beadle. Some snapped cartilage in her neck told her that she died from strangulation. Someone had killed her with his bare hands. That someone, investigators believed, was her husband, Tony Vick. The sheriff's department finally had the evidence they needed to secure an arrest warrant for Tony Vick. But they still didn't know where he was. His photograph and description were entered into the NCIC, a database that connects law enforcement agencies throughout the country. A few days later, Knox County sheriffs received a call. Tony Vick was apprehended for stealing a $100 suit from a store outside of Atlantic City, New Jersey. When police there ran his name through their database, they learned that he was wanted for much more than shoplifting. Detectives theorized that soon after the death of his first wife, Vick had his eye on Kathy, not for her love or companionship, but strictly for her money. The man Kathy came to trust and love soon began plotting her murder. A year before Kathy disappeared, Tony gave Ray and Fleeta Holliday a fax machine. He knew that in order to collect the $8,000 a month Kathy received from her first husband's death, it would need to appear as if she were alive. In April of 1996, after all of the elements of his plan were in place, Tony Vick carried out the murder in the couple's home. After strangling her, he dug a grave, then covered it with concrete, thinking it would conceal his guilt from the world. He then sent faxes to the family in Kathy's name, assuring them that their daughter was alive. But Sergeant Spangler's dog uncovered the truth. Tony Vick was convicted of the first-degree murder of Kathy Beadle and sentenced to life in prison. He was subsequently found guilty of killing his first wife. He received an additional life sentence. When the human senses reach their limit, man's best friend can become a detective's greatest asset. Whether they're used to sniff out arson, track a missing person, or uncover a hidden grave, no rival can beat the dog when it comes to finding the scent of the kill.